Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight here at the Dearborn Public Library. I'm very, very excited to talk with Bryan Burrough, the author of his new book, The Gunfighters: How Texas Made the West Wild. You get a picture book here. And just have a couple of announcements for before we get started. On Tuesday, in 2 weeks' time, Tuesday, August 12th at 6:30, I'll be talking with Lori Gwen Shapiro, author of the new book on Amelia Earhart, called The Aviator and the Showman, Amelia Earhart, George Putnam, and the marriage that made an American icon. So please join us then. You can all the proper information is on our events page. And then I just have a great offer for anyone who purchases a book today or after a purchase a book of Bryan, purchase a copy of Bryan's book. Bryan was nice enough to sign a supply of book plates. Just get in touch with me. You can stop by the library here, or you can send a note to my email, glodge@dearborn.gov, and yeah, I'll be glad to drop a book plate in the mail. Of course, I'll need proof of purchase that you bought it today or after, but I'll be glad to drop it in the mail. So it's a wonderful book, especially for those who really like Westerns. So please, I encourage you to purchase a copy. So let's introduce Bryan. Bryan is the author or co-author of 8 books, 4 of them New York Times bestseller, including the Wall Street Classic, Barbarians at the Gate, and most recently, Forget the Alamo, The Rise and Fall of the American Myth. A longtime correspondent at Vanity Fair. That's where I first read his work and really enjoyed it. And now he's an editor-at-large at Texas Monthly. He lives in Austin, Texas. So please welcome Bryan Burrough.
Hey, y'all. Thanks for having me on.
So usually I like to ask the first question. Did you want to be a writer when you grew up? Were you growing up as a kid?
No, the only thing I ever wanted to be was a newspaper reporter. We had a little elementary school newspaper in 6th grade, and I thought that was the greatest thing in the world. You get your name in the newspaper all the time. So I took the journalism class that was offered at the high school. And my goal, as far as I grew up in a small town in Central Texas, and the furthest I could see was the Dallas Morning News. So my goal in life was to be the police reporter for the Dallas Morning News. And I went off to the University of Missouri to get a journalism degree and ended up doing more than just covering cops.
Well, no, it is in the book. You emphasize the important how Texas, as a general overview, how Texas impact and the people who live there. They had so much of an impact on the West, and the introduction to your book, The Big Rich, you write, it's hard to explain what it means to be a Texan. Can you elaborate on that thought?
Well, unlike a lot of wonderful places you can live in the country, Texas is burdened or happy to have a good deal of mythology, especially around its history and around its creation. So I'm not kidding when I say there are writers who still sit around in Texas talking about the next book they're going to write about the Alamo or Goliad or fighting the Comanches. I mean, I'm hosting a group of writers here tonight. There'll probably be 40 here, and at least 10 of us have written something about Texas history. It's just not the same in Arkansas. I don't think it's the same in Ohio, but it there's a richness to the history here. Obviously, wars against Mexico, time as an independent country, and there's so much mythology wrapped up in that a lot of us have made a nice little pastime at kind of coming up with more accurate versions of whatever happened, as opposed to the version of Texas history that is so broadly and widely celebrated. It's such a big deal here, Dan. I mean, we actually used to throw around the term Texas exceptionalism, the idea that Texans just believe that they're pretty much better than all the other states.
Well, I'll give that Texas went through a lot. They fought off the Mexicans. But the Civil War had a great impact on Texans because they were caught up in the Confederacy, and they really, and that kind of impacted it sort of led to the development of gunfighters, or some of gunfighters.
Texans were instrumental in the introduction of the first revolvers in the 1840s, which set the stage for this gunfighter era that I'm writing about, which is from the first nationally recognized gunfight in 1865 until I ended it in 1901. But we sometimes forget that when Samuel Colt of Massachusetts introduced the first actual revolver, a 6-shot gun, in the late 1830s, it was a total flop. Nobody noticed. By the time the Texas Rangers, a little group called the Texas Rangers that no one had heard of, discovered these guns, a shipment of these guns in a warehouse in 1844, Colt was long out of business. And it was the Texas Rangers who took these revolvers out of storage, began using them against the Comanche, and then found that they were imperfect. They were very large and very difficult to reload. And history records that it was a young Ranger named Samuel Walker, who had become a hero during the Mexican War, who went back east and worked with Sam Colt to perfect the Colt Walker, the first real functioning revolver, which set the stage for everything that happened in the Old West afterwards.
Well, I think you mentioned in previous talks that there was so much guns left over from the Civil War that the Texas governor gave them away or had an auction.
Well, when you look at this era of the great gunfighters, and we're talking about Billy the Kid and Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday, the period Wild Bill Hickok, it's from 1865 to 1901. So common sense tells you the war must have had something to do with this spectacular violence that broke out on the American frontier that we still talk about today. And, one facet of that would be, a lot of people speculated, gosh, a lot of these guys must have been damaged by the war. And there has been new research on PTSD as contributing to frontier violence. That's pretty much speculative. What's not, though, is what you mentioned, and that is in 1865 and 1866, the federal government auctioned or gave away 1.3 million sidearms, such that the phenomenon that we know as open carry was not unheard of before the war. You can find memoirists who tour the rural South who were surprised to see men actually wearing a gun on their hip. After the war, it becomes a thing. After the war, you can find memoirists saying, oh my God, I was just in Missouri. Can you believe everybody there is all the men are wearing guns like they used to wear neckties? And so that's certainly the prevalence of 6-shot revolvers as an item that many men wore on the frontier in rural areas. I think that's clearly a contributor to this spectacular gunfighter violence that we saw break out.
Well, okay, let's talk about what is the Gunfighters Code and what is the Cowboys Code.
Well, the first thing we should do is define our terms for those who don't marinate in this like authors do. When we talk about a gunfighter, we are talking about any civilian who engaged in exchange of gunfire in the Old West, not involving soldiers, so no blue coats, and not involving Native Americans. So typically, what you're talking about is sheriffs and marshals like Wyatt Earp, outlaws like Billy the Kid, cattlemen, cowboys, feudists, detectives, that type of thing. I forgot how you got me to that place. Oh, the difference in the codes. So the challenge for me in looking at this period is, how do you tell a single story about all these disparate gunfights that clearly, one gunfight in Montana has nothing to do with one in Texas. Indeed, if you go back and look at previous gunfighter books going back to the 60s when they first became popular, the lion's share is 17 chapters on 17 gunfighters. There's no commonality. So the challenge for me was, what is the commonality? Is there commonality? And I ended up, without going on and on like an academic with you here, ended up tracing the gunfights in the Old West to the gunfights that we had in the antebellum South, which were known as duels, which were a very different type of thing. They had rules and seconds and judges standing around to make sure things were went the way they were supposed to do. The formalities of the duel fell away, I argue, in the book as this behavior moved west into Texas. What didn't, though, was the male honor codes that were so prevalent in the 19th century, especially in the antebellum South, clearly migrated to Texas. And then I argue beyond, and we can talk about how that happened in a second. But, in a world of, 1835 Mississippi or 1855 in Texas, where we didn't have a lot of university degrees to put on our walls or financial statements to show each other, the way men, and we are talking about men, were graded by and large was by their honor. And, these codes called on men to be, loyal and brave, but the key thing, and courteous to women, but the key thing here was that if your honor was besmirched, if it was impugned, if somebody said you were ugly, or your cow was ugly, or your daughter was ugly, you were given the opportunity, in some cases the obligation, to respond with violence, even deadly violence. And so that was a code that some people, when they see it migrate out west, have called it the cowboy code. Most prominently, there's something that writers back in the middle 20th century, those who were able to interview aging frontiersmen, called the Code of the West. And the Code of the West is absolutely the antebellum male code out on the frontier, meaning, you had an obligation to protect yourself against any moment of any aggression, no matter how micro, against any insult. And given on the frontier the paucity, especially in the early years, of law enforcement, the prevalence of alcohol and gambling and all sorts of things that tended to create disagreements among men, what I argue that you find on the frontier is that old Southern code migrating through Texas, and it emerges on the frontier as something like a male honor code on steroids.
Well, that leads me to ask, you developed the book over a long period of time.
Yeah.
Can you talk about how it took a long time to make that connection?
Yeah, I put out a book, and I think it was in 2004, that some people may remember, called Public Enemies, which was a look at the FBI's fight against John Dillinger and Bonnie and Clyde and a number of bank robbers during the Depression. And when that book was over and it was successful, I said to my editor, hey, now that I've gone that far back to write about criminals, I really want to write about the only other period before the 20th century when Americans got famous shooting each other and robbing things, and that was in the Old West. And I was stunned when he said, so what's the book? I said, Gunfighters. He's like, no. You can't write an episodic book. I don't want something that's 17 chapters on 17 gunfighters. You have to find a way to tell all the story as one. And it took me 13 years to figure out how to do it. And when I did it, I came up with this idea of male honor being prevalent. I looked at the way that spread into Texas. And then the key thing that allowed this to become a book was the discovery of the incredible violence that broke out in Texas in the 10 years after the war. it came in two waves. The first associated with the war, which was, Texas had not been conquered. It had never had anything like an actual battle. And it was a very incredible on its soil. And it was incredibly proud populace. People don't talk about Michigan exceptionalism. They talk about Texas exceptionalism. And so when occupying blue-coated troops came to Texas, many of them, men of color, Texans responded with something like a rebellion, an open rebellion, for 5 years, in which if you wore a blue uniform or if you were a person of color, there was a good chance that Texans were just going to shoot you down without consequence. It was some really nasty stuff, including 4 or 5 of the deadliest feuds in American history. The second wave of that violence had nothing to do with the war. It was all about the emergence and spread of the open range Texas cattle business, which became the biggest business in the Old West. It was a business that had always existed in Texas, but really became a thing with the first stockyards opened in Chicago immediately after the war. They needed Texas cattle. The only beeves in the country, pretty much 90% of them, were in Texas. So Texans needed to get their beef north because there were no railroads at the time. So at a time that Texas was torn by what some academics have decided was the single most violent civilian period of American history, the 10 years in Texas after the war. That would have been kind of interesting if it stayed in Texas and we could talk about kind of bloody Texas. But I argue in this book that behavior did not stay in Texas. That violence didn't stay in Texas. It moved up the Chisholm Trail in a series of parallel cattle trails, first to Kansas, but also to New Mexico, to Arizona, and throughout the frontier. There was a Texas diaspora. Every cow that came to populate a ranch or a meadow, from the Dakotas to Montana to Utah to Arizona, 95% of those cattle came from Texas, and they came with Texans, Texas cowboys. In fact, for the longest time, Texas cowboy was redundant. There was no other kind. And the Texas cowboys who came were a spectacularly violent type of gentleman. They had been raised during the time of spectacular violence. And the first kind of the gunfighter era really begins. It becomes a thing. It achieves national fame when these Texans began arriving in the first 5 cow towns in Kansas, from Abilene and Wichita on to the legendary Dodge City. I say in this book that, when you look at all the famous gunfighters, those you've heard of like Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson and Wild Bill Hickok, down to the famous ones that you haven't, like Clay Allison and many more, Luke Short, those famous Kansas cow towns really became the Madison Square Garden of the gunfighter age. They were the one place where most of the marquee gunfighters of the Old West first popped onto the newspaper radars.
Well, Dave, got several thoughts there. First off, I want to say I loved how you wrote the book. It's like you wrote it as if we're talking now. That kind of conversational, or at least I took it as that. And also, you would be a good librarian. All the references, all the references, the footnotes. It sounded like you didn't necessarily go to a lot of libraries. You just got books.
I got every book.
Yeah.
There were 2 things I wanted to do here. One was I moved away from the classic top-down stern author's voice in my last book, Forget the Alamo, for a number of reasons. It was going to be controversial in Texas, and so I needed to be friendly. I needed the book to be accessible. And the voice that I used in that book was very popular, and I got good feedback on. So I said, I'm going to use it in this one. So to the extent that you find the Gunfighters conversational and as if we were talking, it's because that was my exact intention. I did not want to write this like something written by an author or an associate professor. I wanted this to be like 2 people talking over a sweet tea or a Modelo, someplace. I wanted it to be friendly and easy. Also, I really wanted it at a time where a lot of Americans aren't as intimately familiar with Old Western history as they might have been 50 years ago, I knew that this was going to be new territory for a lot of people. And I knew that I'm writing about every major and many minor gunfighters that you've ever heard of. And so what I wanted in the book, the footnotes became a major thing for me, Dan. I've got a chapter or three on all the major gunfighters, but I can't tell you everything about Wyatt Earp. I can't tell you everything about John Wesley Hardin. So the footnotes, became the place to say, hey, reader, if you want to know about John Wesley Hardin, read this, this, and this, and don't read this. And this book and this movie is really boring. I wanted it to be kind of one-stop shopping for someone who thought the Old West was kind of interesting and wanted to know more.
Yeah, exactly. The footnotes were a way, like you said, to throw in little additional things about it, about the different gunfighters that would be interesting. And yeah, it's like part of librarian is saying, hey, if you like this book, read this book.
Yep.
And that's exactly my thought. It was like, yeah, he's got it. You got it. And then the next thought, yeah, like you were talking before, cowboys were there. I think you said cow dash boys. One point, they were feared because they were so often crazy, or maybe not the best word, but just they shoot from the hip, sometimes literally.
Yes. We forget now because we only view cowboys today through the lens of all sorts of, sweet cowboy movies, Gene Autry and Rock Hudson and such. But if you go back to, the first 20 years where they were in the public consciousness in the 1870s and 1880s, cowboys were feared. They were something like a Russian Cossack. They were viewed as extraordinarily violent, prone to all sorts of insults for whatever reasons, including, supposed besmirching of their honor. And that really took years to change because, in those early years, I mean, one of the things I was most fascinated by was in the early years, a year after the gunfight beside the OK Corral, a year after Billy the Kid was shot down, you actually saw something that I've never seen anybody write about. You saw a movement in the cattle industry press. Yes, there was such a thing, to disarm cowboys, to get them to, enough with the Winchesters, enough with the six shooters. There's been too many, cowboys. Cowboys did crazy stuff. They literally did the stuff you see in bad movies. Riding around on a horse and shooting your gun in the air. That was what people did when they didn't have the internet. But even the weirder stuff like, have you ever seen a really bad Western where the mean guy will approach some tenderfoot, a judge or a teacher, and shoot at his feet and say, now you dance? They actually did that too. I've gotten multiple examples of now you dance. Who does that? Well, that was the type of stuff that cowboys became legendary for doing. But, and if you want to take the academic take on it, and I think it's fascinating, you really have to, that conflict between the plainsman, the cowboy, and civilized city folk in Kansas and everywhere. I mean, that is a type of dichotomy conflict that we've seen going back to ancient Greece. You can go back to ancient Greece and find civilized Athenians, weeping and crying about the, Scythians on their horses. I mean, it's a type of thing that, dozens of civilizations have gone through. We just don't usually think of it that way here because our view of cowboys is so different.
Now, mythology played a part, especially in cases like Wild Bill Hickok, and also how people perceived that time up until, say, your book. Can you talk about how, yeah, like in Hickok's case, how his 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 what he did kind of got blown out of proportion,
You
uh,
think?
and and also how like the Louis L'Amour novel, how the first the first fast draw and how that became what people thought of.
Well, there are two places that I think mythology plays into this most cleanly. What you're referencing is the second. I'll get to that in a moment. But the first place was just this, and that is, why do these people matter? Why are we talking about Wyatt Earp, who was basically a glorified policeman in a town of 5,000 150 years ago? Why are we still talking about him? He clearly had, he and his ilk, the Gunfighters, they had no political significance, no sociological significance. I mean, their influence was purely cultural in our entertainments, especially in the 20th century, in our books, and especially in our movies. So I wondered, why the heck is that? There were people on the streets of New York and Boston and Baltimore at the time who shot other people all the time, and nobody remembers them. What was it about the Old West that made these people so memorable? And I read a lot of smart academics, so I don't think this was purely my own idea, but I embraced it. And that is clearly much more than the Revolutionary War, much more than those, George Washington and James Monroe and a bunch of guys running around in powdered wigs. I think the Old West became the basis of the American creation myth. And that is, if you believe that the primary religion of America is really individualism, the American dream, after all, is defined by many as what one person, what one American can do, on his or her own. And nowhere, I'd argue, do we see those conditions more ready and more prevalent than on the American West, where hundreds, thousands of Americans went out onto the open prairie with nothing but a gun and, their smarts to make something of themselves. And there's something about the stories of these gunfighters that connects with us this way, that it becomes the or a defining American myth. And I think it's all around that worship of individualism. Now, where you use the question about mythos, you're basically talking about fake gunfighters. Like, a lot of people who review this book, and golly, the reviews have been very generous, thankfully, want to say that it's about myth. It's about a myth busting book. And in some cases there are some, but in some cases, such as the prevalence of violence in Texas, I'm actually saying, hey, the myth is so much worse than we knew. But the one place where there is some serious myth busting going on, if I can say that, is in the question of a handful of the best known gunfighters. The first would be Wild Bill Hickok, who was the first nationally known gunfighter, thanks to a single gunfight, news of which was it was in Springfield, Missouri in 1865, and it was picked up. The news of it was picked up by a magazine writer who wrote an incredible article about this Wild Bill Hickok in Harper's Weekly a year or two later. And basically, he came out and said that this fella Hickok had easily killed over 100 white men, that he had no doubt he was an American legend like Sinbad the Sailor. And by the research of most Hickok biographers and by me, the actual number would appear to not be 100, but 2. So I argue that Hickok was really the fake patient zero at the basis, at the beginning of this legend. The odd thing about Hickok is that, in part because he became so famous, overnight famous, he began getting hired as a marshal. People, would pick on him, say, oh, Mr. Gunfighter guy. So he actually did become involved in a series of notable gunfights. He's that rare fraud who kind of grew into his legend. Then you have someone like Johnny Ringo, who was one of the many gunfighters who got television shows of their own during the 1950s. And Johnny Ringo was a guy who came out of Texas, and is known by most aficionados and by those who watched the Kurt Russell Tombstone in 1993 as one of the Earp brothers' primary bad guys that they fought. And Johnny Ringo, from the 20s, when he was rediscovered by journalists and historians, well until the 1970s, was held up as not just one of the great gunfighters of the Old West, but the smart one, the learned one, a guy who could speak, Latin speeches, that he was a college man. And it turns out that not a word of it was true, including the gunfighter part. Like the one, he was not involved in a single gunfight in Tombstone. His contribution to history would seem to be that he got into one super awkward argument with Doc Holliday in the street and had to be arrested before one of them did pull a gun. In fact, the only moment of violence that Johnny Ringo can be actually associated with is his own death, when he was found dead with a bullet hole in his head, and it appeared that he killed himself. He was a drunk, among other things. Now, we can't blame, Johnny Ringo. There's not an iota of evidence that he created any of this. It was purely created by writers 40 and 50 years later. The only other one I might mention is a fellow named Wild Bill Longley, who for years was kind of the second best known Texas gunfighters behind the great, or awful, depending on your point of view, John Wesley Hardin. Longley was so well known that he too got a TV series in the late 1950s. The actual Longley of history was a complete nobody until arrested in 1876. At the time that Hardin and Gunfighters were just beginning to get a good deal of publicity. And he announced to a journalist and to several more that came afterwards that he had killed as many or more men as John Wesley Hardin. And I believe he put the actual number in his roamings across the Midwest and the frontier at 42. And so when he went to the gallows not long after in the town of Giddings, Texas, east of Austin, and was known for the ensuing 100 years as one of the great gunfighters. We now know, thanks to a really wonderful biography by a friend of mine named Rick Miller, that put out in the 90s, that it was almost entirely bullshit. It was all just fiction. We believe the best numbers are that he actually killed 5, maybe 6 people, all of them in ambush or in the back, meaning he wasn't a gunfighter. The best you could say is he was a multiple murderer.
Do you see any comparisons? You wrote one of your previous books, Public Enemies, was about bank robbers, and I was very surprised to learn how there weren't a whole lot of bank robberies in the Old West. More train robberies, but not a whole lot of bank robberies. But do you see any connection between John Dillinger, his actions, and is kind of like a morphing of the gunfighters?
Not really, because, Dillinger, like most of the Depression era outlaws, was, if he was in a gunfight, it meant that his effort to rob something had failed. This book, while it does include some outlaws, Butch Cassidy and such, outlaws generally were interested in robbing something. They didn't want to get in a gunfight. So it happened. But, the majority of the gunfighters I'm writing about were not outlaws. I too, though, was shocked, because I thought that bank robbery was such a big deal in the Old West, because, I'm sorry, it's just every movie you've ever seen, somebody robs a bank, right? It turns out that bank robberies were all but unknown into the 1890s, for the simple reason that there was very little hard currency in the Old West. Outside Denver, outside San Francisco, there weren't a ton of banks, and certainly not that many in the small towns. And so I wondered why that was. And there's actually an entire wonderful book about this, about how Jesse James, who was by far the biggest and best known of the bank robbers, the first celebrity criminal in America. And after he was killed in, I want to say 1881 or two, his legend kind of was rewritten many times in many bad dime novels and pulp fiction, and that increasingly took his story from where it actually happened in Missouri and retold it out in the Old West, such that over the years, many people came to believe Jesse James was out, in the Old West. Now, I tell his story under protest because, in my point of view, Jesse James is not an Old West gunfighter. He's not even an Old West criminal. He is a Midwestern bank and train robber. But I tell his story basically because his career is at least gunfighter adjacent, and candidly, I think people were expecting it. If I didn't write about Jesse James's book, I think people were going to feel gypped.
Well, yeah, that kind of leads me to people at the time kind of they thought his actions were justified because, yeah, he's a robber, but he also showed loyalty to family and friends. He he was a human being, I guess.
There were a lot of people, especially Southern partisans, who wanted to cheer Jesse James on because James's story, as much as anybody in this book, is about politics, post-war politics, as opposed to violence. He was an inveterate, diehard Confederate, a diehard rebel. And, his bank robberies were accompanied in the newspapers and in his letters and in his pronouncements as very much, continuing the war against Yankees. And so there were people who wanted to make more of him or who wanted to cheer him on. The other one that I hold up with such ambivalence is Billy the Kid. You can read, I could write 15 different books on Billy the Kid and portray him everything from a good guy to a bad guy. His story is so, on the face of it, as portrayed mostly in the newspapers at the time, he was a murderer and an outlaw. But even at the time of his death, you could see the first sense of a change in that behavior because he was so daring, his escapes and his gunfights, because he was loyal to his friends. And of course, as the 20th century has gone on, for whatever reason, Billy the Kid's story is reinvented for every generation to kind of present the generation, whether the 60s era thing where all the outlaws had to be, fighting authority, to today. I'm not even sure what Billy the Kid means today any more than Jesse James. Their names have been run through the washing machines of popular culture so often. I think they're names that most people don't really associate with any moments of history or actual facts. That was that's one of the things I really am trying to correct here, is to reclaim these people for their actual stories and reintroduce them to a generation of Americans really that didn't grow up with this stuff the way I did back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Yeah, exactly. That's my reaction to the book. Did you read, in researching and reading all about these books, did it change your opinion about people, some people, some fighters?
I've been reading gunfighter books since I was 11, but I actually didn't have strong opinions on a lot of them. I'd read a book here, a book there. If there is a big five of gunfighters, they would be Hickok, Billy the Kid, Wyatt Earp, John Wesley Hardin, and I'm always leaving out somebody. Hardin, who is the Texan who may have killed more men than any of these gunfighters, somewhere between 26 and 42, all by the time he was 21, by the way. I think that few Texans and few people really have a sense of what a psychopath this guy was. The lion's share of his killings basically were results of arguments where he just got offended. Somebody said something against him or against Texas, and he'd up and shoot you. Jesse James, I certainly developed a new appreciation with. The idea that Hickok was a fake, at least at the birth of his fame, that was new to me. But the single biggest thing to wrestle with for me was Wyatt Earp. Wyatt Earp is the one gunfighter, the one person in this book who, at a time where the reputation of many of these people, like I don't think 99 out of 100 people in this country could tell you who Wild Bill Hickok really was, much less Bat Masterson. Wyatt Earp is still a household name. And despite the fact that we know that before he became a lawman, he and his brothers were pimps, they ran brothels. And now there's new research found barely 25 years ago that for the entirety of his career as a lawman on the old Western frontier, Wyatt Earp was also an escaped federal prisoner. He had been arrested for horse thievery, put in a federal jail in Van Buren, Arkansas, and he escaped. 1 year later, he emerged as a deputy in Wichita. Despite all that, and despite knowing full well that there would be something sexy in taking down Wyatt Earp, I can't do it. If you've read everything out there about Wyatt Earp, you know that he was the real deal. You know that at a time of kind of workaday barbarism, at a time so many law enforcement officials in the Old West were corrupt or drunk or both, Wyatt Earp really represented, when he emerged in the late 1870s, as a new breed of professional lawman. He came along with the first wave of the reinvented Texas Rangers, who brought, by and large, a lot of law and order to Texas. And so I knew there was probably a market in taking Wyatt Earp down, and I just couldn't do it. I actually think when you compare him against his peers, he's even more impressive, really, than he is in some of these movies.
With the idea of that you have a hard stop at the bottom of the hour, just a couple more questions. Did you think about writing about the other side of the sheriffs and the law enforcement about the book? Even, I mean, you do mention it, but maybe talking about the Texas Rangers and how they had an effect on things?
The Rangers are in the book 3 or 4 places, and that is one where I did have to kind of make the decision that this was going to be a book about the broadest scope of gunfighters and not just the Rangers. There were probably 2 or 3 Rangers I could have written about more because of the number of men they killed. And I just don't, I was drawn more to the men who didn't have obvious reasons to be shooting people. With marshals and sheriffs, it was often part of their jobs. I was more drawn to people like John Wesley Hardin, who on paper was just a gambler and a cattleman, and yet consistently shoot people, like 15 people in 1 year. That type of gunfighter was really what drew me most. That, and wanting to come up with sharp new takes where I could on the big names. The most fun in this, of course, was introducing all sorts of gunfighters that people have never heard of or have forgotten.
Okay, let's see. What heard you're working on a book, or want to talk about a book about thinking about a book about pirates next?
Well, I turned this one in, and they were very happy. They liked that it is conversational, that it's casual, that it's, yet I aspire to an academic rigor. And they said, could you do the same thing on pirates? Meaning not just any pirates, but the golden age of pirates from 1650 to 1725. So Blackbeard, Captain Kidd, all the ones you've heard of. And I've been reading about pirates as long as I've been reading about gunfighters. I think 6th grade. And the problem with pirates is the literature, the research, ongoing research has not turned up a vast amount of new information. I mean, people writing a book about the golden age of piracy right now are probably dealing, 90% of the information is the same information that was out there in 1925. And so I initially said no. I said, come on, there's been 1,100 pirate books. They're all the same. And I went out and spent all last summer looking for what I wanted to do instead. For a moment there, I thought I was going to write a new history of Texas, when I realized my heart really wasn't in it. I didn't care enough. Finally, my wife said, honey, you're 63. Don't you just want to do something that would be fun? She said, what would be fun? And I'm like, effing pirates. I'm going to do pirates just because I want to.
Well, I tell you, I should research my family history, but on my maternal side, we're supposedly related to a privateer and uh, Ireland, because Irving, English, uh, Irish area. So that's what was like, wow, bingo.
Well, there were an awful lot of Irish that went to sea because there wasn't a lot of reason to stay in Ireland back in those days.
So, and what are you finally, what are you reading now?
I'm trying to avoid reading as much as possible right now. So I'm kind of going through my stacks of the New Yorker, and I just finished a book. It was okay on the Eagles, the rock and roll group. I read everything about popular music for some reason, and I've never written about it. And I try to read purely for pleasure because so much of my day is plowing through books that it's harder for me to enjoy them as a pastime the way I used to. That's an awful thing to confess to a librarian and a librarian group, but there it is.
Oh, yeah, that's no problem. I majored in English and history. It took me about a year to after to sit down with a book because that's all you do.
Remember that it's still fun.
Yeah,
It doesn't have to be work. I don't have to
right,
read every book with a highlighter in my hand.
right, exactly. All right, so let's have a time for a question or two. Do you have a question?
Yeah, in Dearborn, it used to be called a restaurant and bar. Back when I was a kid, it was called the Military Inn, when Andy Palmer, and he would go around the country and collect all these guns. I think he had an Annie Oakley gun. He might have had Jesse James gun. He'd buy them for like about $25, $50. And so that's when I first got involved with Westerns and stuff, and like that gunfight at the OK Corral, that lasted about 30 seconds.
It sure did. Exactly 30 seconds.
And then so what's it called? The gunfighters, some of the famous ones, they would carry their guns with the butt
The butts out.
out. So I think Wild Bill did that.
He did. It was called a cross draw.
Yeah. Was it a cavalry draw or something like that, or?
Well,
You would have the two. You have the two guns in your holster high, so that the butts are practically in your stomach, and you pull them across. So instead of, if you're, most men held a gun low in the right hip, and you have to pull it up and then turn it forward. With a cross draw like this, the moment you pull, your barrel is always going forward. So I'm not a shooter, but what you've always heard is that the cross draw, if you could master it, involved one less movement than the conventional of shooting from the hip. Shooting from the hip is probably the least accurate way to shoot a gun, to a pistol.
so
And somebody like a Doc Holliday, he'd shoot you in the back and the front.
Doc Holliday was a physically weak guy from tuberculosis. And Bat Masterson once wrote that, a teenager could have beaten him up. And I think that's one of the reasons that Holliday resorted to weaponry, to guns so quickly, because he was so physically weak.
okay, so let's all right, Comet Howdy from Los Angeles, the guy in the, so, okay, so think 20 after, like I mentioned.
Guys, thank you so much. It was that was a joy to appear for you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your time and work, and have a good party.
Bye,
Talk to
y'all.
you. Yep.